Welcome to Eternal Nightfall Mysteries, my friends. I'm Lawrence, your host, and I cannot tell you how delighted I am that you're here with me tonight. Wherever you are, curled up in Manchester, drifting off in Melbourne, or watching the snow fall in Minnesota, do leave a comment below and tell me where you're listening from. It always brightens my evening. Chapter 1. An Invitation Across the Atlantic. The autumn of 1931 had settled over London like a well-tailored grey overcoat, damp at the cuffs and smelling faintly of coal smoke. In the quiet elegance of Whitehaven Mansions, Hercule Poirot sat at his breakfast table with the precision of a man conducting an orchestra of one. The 2 boiled eggs were exactly 4 minutes. The slices of toast formed perfect equilateral triangles. The coffee breathed its aroma in delicate spirals that offended neither the nostrils nor the symmetry of the universe. George, his valet, entered with the silver salver and placed a single yellow envelope beside the Meissen cup. Poirot regarded it as he might regard an uninvited spider. Telegrams were, by their nature, vulgar things, shouted across oceans when a gentleman would have written on heavy cream-laid paper. Yet the little Belgian's curiosity was stronger than his distaste. He slit the envelope with the special ivory knife kept for that purpose and unfolded the message. The words were typed in urgent capitals. "Arrive Washington soonest. Stop Senator Elias Hawthorne. Requests personal assistance. Stop matter of gravest national importance. Stop President informed. Stop all expenses met. Stop absolute discretion. Imperative stop. Vandermeer Belgian Embassy." Poirot's magnificent moustaches gave the tiniest quiver of surprise. Senator Hawthorne was not simply a powerful man. He was a continent in human form. Chairman of the Senate Naval Affairs Committee. The American who had sat across the table from Ramsay MacDonald and forced the British Empire to scrap battleships it could scarcely afford to keep. A man whose whispered word could move fleets or bankrupt shipyards. And now this titan was afraid. Poirot laid the telegram beside his plate and considered it while he finished the left-hand egg. Fear, he reflected, was the most democratic of emotions. It respected neither wealth nor rank nor the marble corridors of the United States Capitol. When fear came calling, even the mighty opened their doors. He rang the little silver bell. George appeared at once. "George, my friend, we are going to America." "Very good, sir," said George, without the smallest flicker of astonishment. In 7 years he had learned that Poirot's departures were as unpredictable as London weather, and twice as dramatic. By noon the trunks were packed, 3 for clothes, 1 for toiletries, 1 for the green leather notebook in which Poirot recorded the follies of mankind. By 3 o'clock he had taken respectful leave of Chief Inspector Japp at Scotland Yard. "America, eh? Rather you than me, old cock, full of gangsters and chewing gum." By 6, he was aboard the boat train to Southampton, wrapped in the warm embrace of his fur-lined coat and the even warmer embrace of his own self-satisfaction. The voyage on the Majestic was, for Poirot, an ordeal disguised as luxury. The Atlantic in October rolled like a drunkard. The other first-class passengers talked incessantly of prohibition and the stock market crash. The ship's band murdered Debussy every evening. Yet Poirot endured. He walked the promenade deck twice daily, swinging his short arms like pendulums, and spent the rest of his time in his stateroom, arranging and rearranging the contents of his dressing case until the ship's steward begged to be allowed to die. On the 5th morning, the Statue of Liberty appeared through the mist, like a green metal governess, and Poirot felt the familiar tingle at the base of his spine that always announced the beginning of a case. New York assaulted the senses. Horns, shouts, newsboys, the smell of hot pretzels and engine oil. A gleaming Pierce Arrow waited at the pier, its chauffeur holding a card lettered Hercule Poirot in careful copperplate. Within minutes they were gliding south through New Jersey, the great car eating the miles with aristocratic disdain. They reached Washington as dusk was falling. The city spread out beneath a sky the color of a bruised peach. Poirot had expected something brash, something loud. Instead, he found a low white city of columns and domes, half Southern plantation, half Roman forum, with wide avenues that disappeared into parkland and the faint smell of wood smoke on the evening air. It felt, he thought, like a capital that was still pretending to be a village. The Hawthorne Mansion stood on Massachusetts Avenue among the embassies, a vast confection of white marble and Corinthian columns that looked as though it had been designed by someone who had heard of Versailles but lacked the courage to go quite so far. Electric lanterns glowed along the drive. Somewhere a fountain played with well-bred discretion. The butler who admitted him was English. Poirot caught the faintest trace of Yorkshire beneath the starch, and clearly startled to be confronted by a small foreigner with the most extraordinary moustaches in the Western Hemisphere. "Monsieur Poirot, the senator is expecting you." He was led through a hall where crystal chandeliers trembled like anxious dowagers, past portraits of men in uniform who all looked as though they had been born angry, and finally into a library panelled in black walnut that smelled of cigar smoke, leather, and fear. Senator Elias Hawthorne rose from behind a desk the size of a tennis court. He was taller than Poirot had expected, silver-haired, with the shoulders of the Yale oarsman he had once been, and the eyes of a man who had spent 30 years learning exactly how much truth the American people could bear. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, and his voice was deep, slow, the voice that had swayed committees and silenced hecklers. "You came. I am grateful." They shook hands. The senator's palm was dry, the grip firm, but Poirot felt the tremor beneath the skin. "You will take a whiskey? Or perhaps something lighter? I have an excellent Sauternes." Poirot accepted a small glass of the golden wine. They sat in wing chairs beside a fire that crackled with unnecessary enthusiasm. The senator did not waste time. "In 9 days, monsieur. On the night of October the 17th, I am going to die." Poirot sipped, waiting. He had learned long ago that silence is the most devastating question. Hawthorne leaned forward, elbows on knees. "I will be found in my study, shot through the right temple with my son's service revolver. There will be a typed suicide note confessing that I accepted bribes from British armament firms to sabotage American naval construction. The press will feast for months. My work, 15 years of trying to keep the world from another bloodbath, will be spat on, and the men who arranged it will drink champagne in New York clubs and toast their own cleverness." He reached into a drawer and laid a folder on the table between them. Inside were a dozen letters, all typed on the same machine, all identical in their cold fury. "You sold your country unless you vote against the cruiser bill. Your shame will be plastered across every newspaper from Maine to California." Poirot turned the pages with the tips of his fingers, as though they might soil him. "You know who sends these? I know who profits. I know who hates me enough. But proof?" The senator gave a short, bitter laugh. "These people are careful. They leave no fingerprints except the ones they want me to see." He rose and walked to the window. Beyond the glass, The lights of Embassy Row glimmered like cautious stars. "I am not a coward, monsieur. I have faced assassins in the Philippines, strikers in West Virginia, senators who wanted my scalp nailed to the Capitol dome. But this is different. They have chosen a method that will destroy me, even if the bullet misses." Poirot placed his glass precisely in the center of the coaster. "You wish me to prevent this murder. I wish you to be here when it happens, to see the impossible room, and then to prove it was murder, not the cowardice of Elias Hawthorne." The little detective considered. Outside, a clock struck 8, each note falling into the quiet like a pebble into deep water. "You understand, Senator, that Hercule Poirot does not prevent crimes. He avenges them." Hawthorne turned. For the first time that night he smiled. A small, tired movement of the lips. "Then avenge me after I'm dead, if you must. Just make sure the world knows the truth." Poirot inclined his head with grave courtesy. "Very well, I accept. But tell me, why 9 days? Why this precise date?" The senator's eyes darkened. "Because on the 18th the Senate votes on the new cruiser program. If I am disgraced the night before, my allies will scatter. The bill will pass, and the arms race begins again." He held out his hand. "Welcome to Washington, Monsieur Poirot. I'm afraid you will find it a city of magnificent intentions and magnificent lies." Poirot took the hand. "In that, Senator, it is exactly like every other capital I have ever known." The fire settled in the grate with a small apologetic sigh, and somewhere in the great house a clock began to tick toward a murder that had not yet happened. Chapter 2. The night of the 17th. 9 days slipped past like smoke through the fingers. Washington dressed itself in the colors of early autumn, crimson maples along the avenues, the Potomac a dull pewter under racing clouds. But inside the Hawthorne mansion, the air grew heavier with every sunrise. The senator became quieter, his famous voice reduced to a murmur. His wife's laughter rang too brightly. His son drank more than was wise. Even the servants moved on tiptoe, as though the house itself were holding its breath. Hercule Poirot observed everything and said very little. He took his meals in his room, walked each afternoon along the embassy-lined streets, swinging his cane like a metronome, and spent his evenings in the library, studying blueprints of the West Wing until the lines danced before his eyes. The study where the murder was to take place had been built in 1898 for a Secretary of State who feared anarchist bombs. One door of solid oak, one set of French windows onto a narrow terrace, windows barred with ornamental iron, fireplace bricked up during a long-forgotten renovation. A room, in short, that could be turned into a strong box. On the evening of the 17th, the sky pressed low and sulphurous. Thunder growled over Virginia like distant artillery. At 8 o'clock precisely, the household gathered for a dinner that no one tasted. There were only 7 at table. The senator at the head, pale but composed. Mrs. Lydia Hawthorne in scarlet silk that made her look like a dangerous poppy. Captain Richard Hawthorne already flushed with bourbon. Miss Evelyn Marsh in her eternal grey cardigan. Dr. Felix Lang twitching at every flash of lightning. Victor Zane, the journalist, sleek as a seal in midnight blue, and Poirot, immaculate, watching them all with the bright concentration of a bird of prey. Conversation limped. Someone mentioned the World Series. Someone else, the collapse of the Creditanstalt Bank in Vienna. The senator raised his glass with a hand that trembled only slightly and proposed a toast to clearer skies tomorrow. No one found the courage to drink deeply. At 9:30 the senator rose. "I have work to finish," he said simply. "The West Wing will be sealed at 10:15. After that, no one is to enter until morning." His eyes met Poirot's for a long moment, an unspoken message that needed no translation. At 10:00 the guests drifted away. Captain Richard and Victor Zane disappeared toward the billiard room. Dr. Lang pleaded a headache and climbed the stairs. Miss Marsh locked herself in the typing room with a bottle of aspirin. Mrs. Hawthorne kissed the air somewhere near her husband's cheek and floated off in a cloud of French perfume. Agent Tom Riley, Secret Service, checked his watch and took up station outside the West Wing corridor with another agent named Cooper. At 10:15 the ritual began. Riley watched the senator enter his study carrying a crystal tumbler of whiskey. The heavy oak door closed, the key turned, the bolt shot home with a sound like a judge's gavel. Through the open transom, Riley saw the senator cross to the French windows, test the bolts, and draw the velvet curtains. Then silence. Riley and Cooper took their posts, one at each end of the short corridor. From where they stood, they could see the study door, the staircase, and the entrance to the servants' passage. No one could approach without being seen. Downstairs, Poirot sat alone in the library with a small glass of tisane, listening to the house settle. Somewhere a clock struck 11. Rain began to lash the windows. At 11:02 exactly, the gunshot cracked through the mansion like the wrath of God. Riley was already moving. He and Cooper hit the door together, the lock splintered, the bolt sheared. They burst in with revolvers drawn. Senator Elias Hawthorne lay slumped forward across the leather-topped desk. His head rested on folded arms as though he had simply fallen asleep, except for the neat black hole in his right temple and the sluggish red river that crept across the blotter. In his right hand, fingers already stiffening, was a Webley Mark 66 service revolver. A single sheet of paper lay beneath his cheek. Typed upon it, in the unmistakable face of the senator's own Underwood, were the words I can no longer live with the shame. The British bought me, and I sold my country for 30 pieces of silver. Forgive me. The smell of cordite hung thick. The French windows were bolted from the inside, the curtains undisturbed. The oak door had been locked and bolted as they had seen it done. The electric alarm wires that ran to the terrace windows were intact. Their indicator lights glowed steady green on the security panel in the hall. Riley checked for a pulse he knew he would not find. Cooper ran to the telephone and called the White House detail, then the Metropolitan Police. Within minutes, the house was full of men in trench coats and flashbulbs popping like summer lightning. Poirot arrived while the photographers were still at work. He stood in the doorway, hands clasped behind his back, taking in every detail with those extraordinary green eyes. Then he stepped carefully around the pooling blood and bent to examine the body. The senator's left hand, the hand he had used all his life, lay palm up on the blotter clean. The right hand clutched the revolver. Poirot straightened slowly. "No," he said so quietly that only Riley heard him. "This is not suicide. This is murder of the most impeccable insolence." He looked once more at the locked door, the sealed windows, the silent alarms, and the little Belgian smiled. A small, dangerous smile that had nothing to do with amusement. "Someone," he murmured, "has arranged a perfect crime. It will be a pleasure to disappoint them." Chapter 3. The Little Grey Cells. Awakened dawn crept over Washington like a guilty secret, pale and reluctant. The Hawthorne mansion was already thick with police and Secret Service, their voices low, their boots leaving muddy prints on the Aubusson carpets. Outside, reporters clustered at the gates like crows, shouting questions that no one answered. Hercule Poirot had not slept. He stood now in the study, hands clasped behind his back, surveying the room with the calm intensity of a painter judging a canvas. The body had been removed an hour earlier, but the chalk outline remained, and the blood had darkened to a dull rust. The revolver lay in a labelled envelope. The suicide note had been photographed from every angle. Captain Hastings was not present. He was safe in England, no doubt polishing his golf clubs. Yet Poirot spoke aloud, as though addressing his old friend. "Observe, Hastings," he murmured, "the orderliness of murder. Everything in its place, everything designed to say suicide. But the little grey cells, they revolt." He began with the door. The splintered lock had been removed, but the bolt was intact, heavy brass, thrown from the inside. The key still hung on its nail beside the frame, exactly where the senator had left it. No duplicate existed. The locksmith who had installed it 20 years earlier had sworn as much under Poirot's gentle cross-examination. Next, the French windows. Poirot drew back the velvet curtains and examined the bolts top and bottom. They slid sweetly. No resistance, no scratches. The alarm wire, a recent innovation from the Pinkerton agency, ran in a thin copper vein along the frame. A small glass tube of mercury would break and sound a bell if the circuit opened. The tube was unbroken. The bell had never rung. He opened the windows and stepped onto the narrow terrace. Rain had washed the flagstones clean. The iron railing was wet and cold. 10 feet below lay the rose garden, sodden and innocent. No footprints, no ladder marks, nothing. Back inside, Poirot knelt, an operation requiring considerable care with the knees, and studied the Persian carpet. A few threads had been flattened by the senator's shoes as he walked to the desk. Nothing more. He rose and approached the desk itself. The chair had been pushed back exactly 18 inches. He measured with his pocket rule. The whiskey glass stood untouched. A silver propelling pencil lay at right angles to the blotter. Everything symmetrical, everything deliberate. Then he saw it. The revolver had been the senator's son's service Webley, yet the serial number on the butt plate had been crudely filed and re-stamped. Curious. A family heirloom treated like contraband. Poirot lifted the suicide note with tweezers. The paper was the senator's personal stationery, heavy cream stock with the Capitol dome embossed in gold. The typing, however, interested him far more. The letter L rode a fraction high, a defect Miss Marsh had mentioned only yesterday when apologizing for a memo. The machine had developed the fault after she dropped it down the stairs 2 weeks ago. Yet every witness agreed the senator had been alone in the room since 9:45. He laid the note down and sniffed delicately. Cordite? Yes. But beneath it something else, a faint sweetness, almost floral. Attar of roses? No, something medicinal. At that moment, Agent Riley appeared in the doorway, hat in hand, face the colour of putty. Monsieur Poirot, the chief of police wants to rule it suicide and be done. The White House is leaning hard. Poirot turned, eyes glittering. Tell your chief of police that Hercule Poirot does not bow to pressure, even from presidents. This is murder, and I will prove it. He requested, quietly, politely, irresistibly, that the body be left undisturbed until he had completed his examination. The medical examiner, a weary man named Dr. Pritchard, agreed with ill grace. In the improvised morgue in the billiard room, Poirot studied the wound. Entry through the right temple, powder tattooing in a perfect circle. Contact shot. Yet Senator Hawthorne had signed every document for 30 years with his left hand. There were photographs on the desk. the senator raising his left hand to take the oath of office, the senator waving to crowds with his left, the senator even lighting cigars left-handed. To shoot himself in the right temple would have required him to twist his wrist into an unnatural position. Dr. Pritchard shrugged. People do strange things at the end. No, Poirot said softly. People do what they have always done. Habit is stronger than despair. He examined the hands. The right fingers still bore the faint bruising of the trigger guard. The left hand was unmarked, relaxed. No cyanide traces under the nails, no hesitation marks on the skin, simply death. Back in the study, Poirot requested absolute silence. He closed the door, what remained of it, drew the curtains and sat in the senator's chair. He placed his own right hand as the dead man's had been, the imaginary revolver pressed to his temple. The angle felt wrong. To achieve that entry wound, he would have had to crook his elbow like a teapot handle. He tried with his left hand. Natural, comfortable. The bullet path would have been perfect. He opened his eyes and smiled at the empty room. Someone, he announced to the chandelier, has made a small but fatal mistake. At 11 o'clock, he summoned the household to the aide-de-camp drawing room. They came reluctantly, pale, rumpled, smelling of shock and sleeplessness. Mrs. Hawthorne had been crying. Her mascara had left delicate grey rivers down her cheeks. Captain Richard reeked of bourbon. Dr. Lang's hands shook so badly he could scarcely hold a cigarette. Poirot stood before the marble fireplace, small and neat and utterly in command. Mesdames et messieurs, he began, a murder has been committed under impossible circumstances. The room was locked, the windows sealed, the alarm silent, yet murder it is. Before the day is out, I will require certain demonstrations, typing tests perhaps, or a small experiment with sound. But first, I ask only that no one leaves this house. The truth, you see, is a guest who has already arrived. It merely awaits its introduction. He bowed, very slightly, and the little grey cells burned bright behind his eyes. The game, as he liked to say, was well and truly afoot. Chapter 4. Clues and Red Herrings. The morning after the murder, the Hawthorne mansion felt like a ship taking on water. Every corridor echoed with hurried footsteps, every room smelled of cigarette smoke and dread. Outside, the rain had settled into a steady mournful drizzle that blurred the windows and turned the rose garden into a watercolour left in the wet. Poirot began with the revolver. He carried it himself, wrapped in silk as though it were a reliquary, to the ballroom, where trestle tables had been set up under the chandeliers. A police ballistics expert waited, uncomfortable in evening dress borrowed from the senator's valet. Poirot laid the Webley down with reverence. "Observe," he said, pointing with a manicured finger. "The serial number has been obliterated and re-stamped. Crude work. A file first, then acid, then new numbers punched with a jeweller's tool. Why would a suicide trouble himself with such labour?" The expert shrugged. "To hide that it was stolen, maybe. Or to hide that it was never stolen at all," Poirot replied softly. Captain Richard Hawthorne, summoned from the library where he had been drinking brandy since breakfast, turned scarlet. "That's my gun," he said hoarsely. "Father borrowed it a month ago after the first death threat. I never touched the numbers, I swear it." Poirot merely raised an eyebrow and made a small note in his green leather book. Next came the typewriter. Poirot had the senator's underwood carried to the dining table like a sacred relic. One by one the suspects were brought in and asked to type the sentence that appeared on the suicide note. "I can no longer live with the shame." Mrs. Lydia Hawthorne sat gracefully, struck the keys with theatrical flourish, and produced perfect copy. except the telltale high E. She smiled like a woman who knows she is beautiful and therefore forgiven everything. Captain Richard hammered the keys as though punishing them. The carriage return rang like a fire bell. Dr. Lang's trembling fingers missed half the letters. He had to be helped from the chair. Miss Marsh typed quickly, 2 fingers, the way she had done for 15 years. The high E danced obediently. Victor Zane, the journalist, touched the keys with the effortless speed of a man who had written 1,000,000 deadlines. His E sat level and perfect. Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Interesting," he murmured, "most interesting." He dismissed them all and spent the afternoon alone with the machine, tapping out nonsense sentences, listening to the small metallic heartbeat of the keys. When he emerged at tea time, his moustache was positively bristling with satisfaction. That evening, he staged what the servants later called the circus in the drawing room. He had every suspect stand in turn beneath the chandelier, while he walked slowly around them, sniffing delicately. Mrs. Hawthorne smelled of le heure bleu, and something sharper beneath, fear perhaps. Dr. Lang reeked of morphine and unwashed nerves. Victor Zane carried the faint sweetness of the pomade, favoured by Hollywood cameramen. Only Agent Riley smelled of nothing more sinister than government-issue soap. Poirot stopped behind Miss Marsh. "A tar of roses," he announced suddenly. "But not from a bottle, from the garden, non? The senator's roses were treated yesterday with a new American preparation. Copper sulphate and rose oil. You cut the blooms for the dinner table, mademoiselle. Yet there is no trace on your cuffs." Miss Marsh went white. I changed my dress." "Of course," Poirot said kindly. "Of course." Later, in the sealed study, he performed a small experiment that left Agent Riley speechless. He took a service revolver, unloaded, pressed it to his own temple in the right hand, and asked Riley to observe the angle in the mirror. "Impossible without discomfort," Poirot declared. "Now watch." He shifted the weapon to his left hand. The barrel sat naturally against the skin. "You see, the body does not lie." Riley opened his mouth, closed it again, and finally muttered something about left-handed suicides being rare, but not unknown. That night Poirot found the second red herring himself. While the household slept uneasily, he returned to the study with a torch and a magnifying lens. He lay flat on the carpet and peered beneath the desk. There, caught in the brass claw of a table leg, was a single thread of scarlet silk, exactly matching the dress Mrs. Hawthorne had worn at dinner. He pocketed it with a small, satisfied sound. The following morning, he confronted her in the conservatory among the potted palms. "This thread, madame, was found beneath the desk, yet you have sworn you never entered the study last night." Mrs. Hawthorne's beautiful eyes filled with tears that did not quite fall. "I lied," she whispered. "I went to him at 10 o'clock, to beg him for money, one last chance before he changed his will. He refused. I was angry. I tore my dress on the door handle as I left. That is all." Poirot bowed. "Merci, madame. You have been most helpful." By the end of the third day, the police were ready to arrest Captain Richard for fratricide, Dr. Lang for mercy-killing, Victor Zane for blackmail gone wrong, and Mrs. Hawthorne for crimes against fashion. The newspapers had already printed 4 different solutions. Poirot read them all over breakfast, folded the last one with exquisite care, and announced to the empty dining room, "They are all wrong, delightfully wrong. The real solution is still hiding in plain sight, wearing a mask of perfect innocence." He rang the bell for George and asked for his grey spats to be polished. Somewhere in the house, a clock struck 6, and the little Belgian smiled at the sound. The net was tightening, even if no one else could feel the cords. Chapter 5. Complications and Twists. On the 4th morning, the rain stopped as suddenly as a slammed door, leaving the city washed clean and the air sharp enough to cut. Poirot rose early, performed his exercises with military precision, and descended to find the household gathered in the breakfast room like survivors of a shipwreck. No one spoke. The only sound was the clink of Lydia Hawthorne's coffee cup against her saucer, and the faint tremor in Dr. Lang's hand. As he reached for the morphine vial, he no longer bothered to hide. Poirot helped himself to a single peach, sliced it into exact segments, and then dropped his bombshell. Mesdames et messieurs, a second bullet has been found. He laid a small paper packet on the white tablecloth. Inside was a misshapen lump of lead. The gardener discovered it at dawn, embedded in the old brickwork where the chimney was bricked up 30 years ago. It is from Captain Hawthorne's Webley. Same rifling marks, same copper-washed jacket. 2 shots were therefore fired inside that sealed room. Yet only 1 wound, 1 cartridge case, and 1 shot heard. Curious, n'est-ce pas? Silence fell so completely that the ticking of the ormolu clock on the mantel became deafening. Captain Richard was the first to recover. That's impossible. I fired a few rounds at targets 2 days ago, but not in the house. Exactly, Poirot said pleasantly. Yet here is the bullet, and here, he produced a second packet, is a fragment of brick dust taken from the flue, fresh. The mortar was disturbed no more than 4 days ago. Dr. Lang laughed, a cracked sound. So the senator shot at ghosts before killing himself. How very American. Poirot ignored him. His gaze moved to Agent Riley, who had gone the colour of old parchment. You were on duty the afternoon before last, I believe. From 2 until 6. Did you hear anything that might have been a muffled shot? Riley swallowed. No, sir. Quiet as a church. Yet sound travels strangely in old chimneys, Poirot murmured, like confession in a cathedral. That afternoon, Kemp staged his reconstruction. He had the ballroom cleared and the study furniture duplicated with chalk lines and borrowed chairs. He persuaded a reluctant constable to play the corpse, while Poirot himself fired blank cartridges into sandbags at different angles. He timed the echoes with a stopwatch. He dropped books from the ceiling to simulate a falling body. He even persuaded Miss Marsh to scream at precise intervals, while Victor Zane timed her with his journalist's wristwatch. By nightfall, he announced a theory. The first shot was fired hours earlier, perhaps even the previous day, into the bricked-up chimney. The sound was muffled almost to nothing. Then, at 11:02, a clockwork device lowered the revolver against the senator's temple and fired the fatal bullet. The murderer arranged the hand, the note, everything, before slipping out and leaving the room sealed. It was ingenious. It explained the impossible second bullet. It explained the left-handed man with the gun in his right hand. The police were enchanted. They tore out the brickwork at dawn the next day. They found nothing. No mechanism, no string, no timer, only soot, mouse droppings, and a startled spider. Poirot stood in the wreckage of the chimney, hands clasped behind his back, looking for the first time in his life almost mortal. Impossible, he whispered. Again impossible. That evening he did something no one had ever seen him do. He poured himself a large brandy and drank half in a single swallow. In the library, he sat alone while the house slept, the green notebook open on his knee, pages covered with frantic diagrams that grew wilder with every glass. At 2 a.m, he suddenly laughed, a short, sharp bark that made the night footman drop an entire tray of glasses in the hall. He rang for George. "Pack, my friend. We are not defeated. We have been looking through the wrong end of the telescope." At breakfast, he was himself again, eyes bright, moustache magnificent. "One last experiment," he announced cheerfully. "Today we shall recreate the entire evening of the 17th, minute by minute. Everyone will play their exact part. The police have agreed. The White House has agreed. Even the President, I am told, is curious." They gathered at 9 o'clock in the West Wing, the broken door temporarily replaced with plywood. The same storm threatened outside. The same thunder growled. Captain Richard and Victor Zane played billiards with exaggerated concentration. Dr. Lang pretended to read a medical journal, while his foot tapped an agitated rhythm. Mrs. Hawthorne drifted through in another scarlet dress, trailing perfume and unease. Miss Marsh typed phantom letters in the adjoining room. Agent Riley and his partner took up their posts. At 10:15 the plywood door was closed, locked, bolted. The French windows were secured. The alarm lights glowed green. Poirot himself sat in the study with a stopwatch and a portable gramophone he had borrowed from the Belgian embassy. At 11:01 he started the machine. A gunshot, recorded earlier that afternoon in the garden, blasted from the horn with startling volume. At the same instant, every light in the West Wing went out. In the darkness came shouting, running feet, the crash of the door being broken a second time. When the lights returned 30 seconds later, Poirot was standing in the middle of the study, holding a small black box with trailing wires. "A simple timed relay," he explained calmly, "connected to the main fuse box in the basement. The murderer arranged for the lights to fail at the exact moment the recorded shot was played. In the confusion, 30 seconds was enough to open the French window, fire the real shot, place the revolver, and escape across the terrace. The alarm was disabled for those same 30 seconds by a second device. This one." He held up a tiny clockwork switch. "Both removed in the darkness by our clever friend." He looked around the circle of stunned faces. The impossible crime was not impossible at all. It was merely theatrical. For the first time in 4 days, no one spoke. The only sound was the rain beginning again, soft and relentless against the windows of a house that now had far more to hide than one dead senator. Chapter 6. The Revelation. The rose garden smelled of wet earth and bruised petals. A low mist drifted between the pruned bushes, catching the weak afternoon sun like a veil drawn across a guilty face. Poirot had asked that every person still breathing in the Hawthorne house be brought here. Servants, police, suspects, even the bewildered White House liaison who had arrived too late to stop anything. They formed a ragged semicircle. Mrs. Hawthorne wrapped in sable against the chill, Captain Richard swaying slightly, though it was barely 4 o'clock, Dr. Lang clutching a silver flask as though it were a lifebelt, Miss Marsh clutching nothing at all, Victor Zane with his reporter's notebook already open, Agent Riley trying to look anywhere except at Poirot. The little Belgian stood beneath the study's French windows, directly under the terrace where no foot had officially trod on the night of the murder. In his gloved hand he held a single crimson rose, freshly cut, its stem still bleeding pale sap. He began without preamble, his voice carrying easily in the damp air. "You all believed you were witnesses to an impossible crime. A man shot in a sealed room, door locked, windows bolted, alarms silent, guards watching. And yet the man is dead by his own revolver, a confession beneath his cheek. Suicide, the police said. Murder, I said. Both were wrong. The truth is simpler and far more cruel." He turned the rose slowly so that every drop of sap caught the light. First, the wound. A left-handed man does not comfortably shoot himself in the right temple. Second, the note typed on a machine that had been alone with a dead man for hours. Third, the alarms that never rang. Fourth, the second bullet in the chimney that was never fired in the chimney at all. And fifth, this is the detail that condemned you all, the recorded gunshot. He let the silence stretch until Dr. Lang's breathing became audible. Mr. Victor Zane possesses a portable vitaphone apparatus, the same used in the new talking pictures. On the afternoon of the 16th, while Captain Hawthorne fired practice rounds in the garden, Mr. Zane recorded a single clear gunshot onto a wax disc. He is, after all, a modern journalist. Sound is his new toy. Zane opened his mouth, thought better of it, closed the notebook. That evening, Poirot continued, the conspirators put their plan into perfect motion. At 10:55, Dr. Felix Lang, who had the freedom of the house as the senator's physician, entered the study carrying a small medical case. He asked the senator for one last private consultation. The senator, trusting his oldest friend, agreed. Dr. Lang administered a swift injection, not morphine this time, but a paralytic distilled from curare, enough to still the heart within minutes, but leave the body supple. While the senator slumped forward, already dying, Mr. Zane slipped in through the French windows. The latch had been filed 2 days earlier by Miss Marsh, who has steady secretarial hands. He placed the vitaphone apparatus on the desk, connected to the house current by a timer set for 11:02. He pressed the senator's right hand around the Webley, and he typed the confession on his own portable Corona, the only machine in the house without the defective E. The senator's underwood was left pristine for us to chase. Mrs. Hawthorne made a small sound, half sob, half laugh. At 11:02, the timer triggered. The recorded gunshot roared from the horn. Agent Riley, paid $5,000 in crisp hundreds, had already disabled the terrace alarm for precisely 4 minutes. In the corridor, the guards heard the shot and smashed the door exactly as planned. In those same 4 minutes, Dr. Lang and Mr. Zane stepped back onto the terrace, closed the window, and walked away through the rose garden. The mist and the darkness hid them. Captain Richard Hawthorne provided the weapon and the earlier target practice for the recording. Mrs. Hawthorne provided the distraction of tears and beauty. Miss Marsh provided access to every key and every timetable. 6 people, 1 perfect murder. He looked at them one by one, gently, almost sadly. You thought to discredit a good man even in death, to push your cruiser bill through a frightened Senate, to sell more battleships to a world already bleeding from the last war. For money, for ambition, for revenge, motives as old as Cain. Agent Riley took 1 step forward, hand slipping inside his coat. Poirot lifted a finger. I wouldn't, mon ami. The garden is surrounded. The president was most insistent. Riley froze. 2 secret servicemen, real ones this time, appeared from the boxwood hedges. Victor Zane gave a short, bitter laugh. You have no proof, Poirot. A pretty story, nothing more. Poirot held up the rose. This was cut yesterday by Miss Marsh. Observe the stem. He snapped it. A bead of white sap welled. Now smell your cuffs, mademoiselle. Miss Marsh's hands flew to her sleeves. The faint sweetness of rose oil was unmistakable. Dr. Lang's medical case contained a curare ampule with 1 missing. Captain Richard's revolver has fresh file marks visible under ultraviolet light. The police have it now. Mr. Zane's vitaphone and disc are in his bedroom beneath the spare shirts. The timer and alarm bypass are in Agent Riley's locker at the Treasury Building. And Mrs. Hawthorne, Ah, madame, your scarlet thread beneath the desk matches the tear in the gown you burned this morning. The ashes still smell of silk." He laid the broken rose on the stone bench. It was a conspiracy so perfect that only its perfection betrayed it. You over-engineered your crime because you feared one another almost as much as you feared the senator. In the end, you hanged yourselves with your own cleverness. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Dr. Lang raised the silver flask in a mock toast. "To Hercule Poirot," he said, voice slurring, "the only honest man in Washington." He drank deeply. 30 seconds later, he was on his knees in the mud, clawing at his throat as the cyanide took him. The others were led away without resistance. Mrs. Hawthorne wept at last, silently, tears cutting channels through the powder on her cheeks. Victor Zane asked only whether the story would make the front page. Captain Richard stared at the ground, as though he might find forgiveness among the fallen petals. Poirot watched them go, then turned to the empty study windows above. The curtains still hung where death had arranged them. He spoke so softly that only the roses heard. "Justice, mes amis, is sometimes the only locked room from which no one escapes." Chapter 7. Justice served. The trials began in the first cold days of January 1932, when the Potomac froze along its edges, and the Capitol dome looked like a wedding cake left out in the snow. Washington, that city of temporary power and permanent scandal, devoured the Hawthorne case the way it devoured everything, quickly, noisily, and without gratitude. They were tried separately, because no courtroom could hold so much hatred in one cage. Victor Zane went first. He turned the proceedings into theatre, smiling for the newsreel cameras, calling witnesses darling, and the judge, Your Honor, darling. The Vitaphone disc was played in open court. The recorded gunshot echoed under the painted ceiling like a memory that refused to die. Zane was sentenced to the electric chair and spent the night before his execution dictating his memoirs to 3 different reporters. When the guards came for him, he was still correcting proofs. Dr. Lang never reached trial. The cyanide he had carried for himself worked faster than the courts. He died in the prison hospital with his eyes open, staring at a ceiling he no longer saw. Miss Evelyn Marsh, the loyal secretary who had betrayed every trust, pleaded guilty on the advice of a public defender who had lost the will to fight. The judge, who had once danced with her at a Senate ball 20 years earlier, gave her life. She was led away still wearing the same grey cardigan, only now it was prison grey. Agent Tom Riley tried to bargain, names, dates, bribes taken by half the Treasury Guard, but the government needed a scapegoat in uniform. He was sentenced to hang, spent 43 days on death row writing letters to a wife who never answered, and met the rope on a morning so cold the trap mechanism almost froze. Mrs. Lydia Hawthorne was the only one who looked beautiful in the dock. The newspapers called her the Scarlet Widow. She denied nothing, admitted little, and wept with such art that half the jury fell in love with her. The other half remembered the senator's blood on the blotter and sent her to the federal penitentiary for women at Alderson. She served 11 years, emerged slender and silver-haired, and vanished into a convent in Quebec. No one ever found her again. Captain Richard Hawthorne, the last and youngest, received the lightest sentence, 20 years, eligible for parole in 12. The judge took into account that he had never entered the study, had never pulled a trigger, had only lent his revolver and his silence. Richard served 8 years at Leavenworth, learned to bind books in the prison shop, and was released in 1940. He changed his name, moved to Oregon, and spent the rest of his life planting trees that would outlive every lie he had ever told. Hercule Poirot attended none of the trials. He sailed for home on the Ile-de-France the day after the Rose Garden revelation, wrapped in the same fur-lined coat in which he had arrived. At Cherbourg, a reporter cornered him on the gangway. "Monsieur Poirot, the American press is calling this the crime of the century. Any comment?" Poirot paused, one small gloved hand on the rail, and looked back toward the grey Atlantic. "Tell your readers," he said, "that a crime is only perfect until someone more perfect arrives to unravel it. And tell them also that Washington is a city where men lock their doors against assassins and forget to lock their hearts against friends." He touched the brim of his hat and disappeared into the first-class saloon. On the voyage, he wrote no notes, accepted no interviews, and drank nothing stronger than sirop de cassis. One evening, as the lights of Ireland rose on the horizon, he stood alone at the rail and opened the small green leather notebook that had accompanied him across the ocean. He turned to the page marked Washington and read the single sentence he had written. On the morning after the murder, 6 murderers for 1 victim. Mon Dieu, what a waste of talent! He tore the page out, folded it into a neat square, and let the wind take it. The paper fluttered once, twice, then vanished into the dark water like a white moth returning to the night. In London, spring arrived early that year. The plane trees along the embankment burst into pale green, and the Thames lost its winter sullenness. Poirot resumed his routine: the precisely boiled eggs, the symmetrical toast, the morning walk through Regent's Park where the daffodils bowed to him as though they knew who had kept the world, for one more season, safe for order. On the first warm afternoon he took tea at Claridge's with a certain chief inspector, who had crossed the Channel especially. "Well, Poirot," said Japp, stirring sugar he did not need, "you've gone and upset the entire American government. They're calling you a meddlesome little frog in the Senate cloakroom." Poirot's moustache quivered with amusement. "And yet, my dear Japp, the cruiser bill was defeated. The naval treaties held for a few more years." Perhaps the world gained a little breathing space because one honest man refused to die dishonoured. Japp grunted. "Still, 6 accomplices. I've never seen the like. Nor will again, I think. It was a crime born of too much fear and too much cleverness. In Europe, we prefer our murders simpler. 1 poisoner, 1 jealous lover, 1 greedy heir. America is still young. She commits her sins on the grand scale." He sipped his tea and smiled at some private memory. "But enough of death. Tell me, Japp, have you tried the new mixture of my tobacconist in the Burlington Arcade? It is sublime." And so the conversation turned, as conversations must, from locked rooms and recorded gunshots to the small, perfect pleasures that make life worth the trouble of solving its crueler riddles. In the quiet of Whitehaven Mansions that night, Hercule Poirot stood at his window and watched the lights of London tremble on the river. Somewhere across the Atlantic, a city of white marble and magnificent lies was already forgetting the senator who had tried to stop a war. But Poirot did not forget. He never forgot. He raised a small glass of tisane to the darkness. "To absent friends," he murmured, "and to the little grey cells that keep the wolves from the door." Then he drew the curtains, turned the key in the lock with the satisfying click of a world made safe for one more night, and went to bed. Outside, London slept the sound and dreamless sleep of a city that believed for a little while longer that justice could still be served. Chapter 8. Epilogue. The Letter That Arrived. 2 late years passed like pages turned by an idle hand. The world lurched from crash to depression, from treaty to rearmament, from uneasy peace toward the sound of distant drums. Hercule Poirot grew no taller, no thinner, and only a little greyer at the temples, as though age itself hesitated to disturb such perfect symmetry. It was a morning in the spring of 1938, the air soft with lilac, and the faint promise that Europe might yet be spared, when George entered the sitting-room carrying a silver tray. Upon it lay a single letter, thick cream paper. The address written in a hand Poirot had not seen for 7 years. The postmark was Quebec. The scent that rose when he slit the envelope was faint but unmistakable, a tar of roses mixed with candle wax and pennants. He read it slowly once, then again, the little grey cells stirring like cats waking from a long sleep. My dear Monsieur Poirot, they tell me in the convent garden that confession is good for the soul. I have confessed to priests who gave me absolution in Latin I only half understood. Tonight, I confess to the one man who will never absolve me, because he knows the exact weight of what I did. You were right about everything except the final count. There were only 5 murderers in that rose garden, not 6. Richard never knew. He lent the revolver because his father asked him to, believing it was for protection. He fired those practice shots because he was proud to show a newsreel man how straight he could shoot. When the conspiracy formed, we kept him drunk and in the billiard room so that his grief would look genuine. He went to prison for a crime he only half understood, and I let him. I was the one who filed the latch on the French window. I was the one who burned the scarlet dress. I was the one who stood in the garden that night and watched Dr. Lang carry the curare ampule like a communion chalice. My beauty, as you called it, was the perfect distraction. No one ever suspects the weeping widow until the weeping stops. But I have carried Richard's bewildered face for 7 years. In the stillness of matins, when the bells ring across the snow, I still hear him asking me, the night before his trial, whether father truly took his own life. I lied to him then with the same lips that had kissed him when he was small and believed I was good. You once said that justice is the only locked room from which no one escapes. I have found another. The convent cell at 3 o'clock in the morning when the past refuses to stay buried. Richard was released last month. He has taken a small house near the Pacific under the name Richard Hale, and plants trees no one will sit beneath for 100 years. He is gentle now, almost holy in his silences. He does not know I am alive. Perhaps that is the last mercy I can give him. I write this on the eve of my final vows. Tomorrow I will put on the black veil, and the name Sister Mary Augustine, and the woman called Lydia Hawthorne will cease to exist in the eyes of God and man. But before I disappear, I needed you to know the exact shape of my damnation. I killed the father, and then I killed the son's faith in everything gentle. If there is any comfort, and I do not ask for it, it is this. The cruiser Bill died with Elias. The ships were never built. The breathing space you spoke of on the Ile-de-France lasted exactly long enough for a generation of European boys to grow to manhood before the next war swallowed them. Perhaps one treaty, one delayed dreadnought, one honest death made a difference after all. You will never answer this letter. I have no address to give, and even if I did, I have forfeited the right to your courtesy. I write only so that somewhere in the world there exists a page that records the truth in full. Thank you for seeing us clearly when we could not bear to see ourselves. Burn this when you have read it. Some confessions should not outlive their sinners. L. H. Poirot, sat very still long after the lilac light had faded from the windows. George, entering to draw the curtains, found his master standing at the fireplace, the letter already curling into flame above the coals. "Will there be anything else, sir?" George asked softly. Poirot watched the last black fragment drift up the chimney. "No, mon ami," he said at last. "There is nothing more to be done. Sometimes the little grey cells must accept that justice has already pronounced its own sentence, slowly, privately, and without appeal." He turned away from the fire. On the mantel stood a small crystal vase containing one perfect crimson rose, sent that morning by an unknown admirer. Poirot lifted it, breathed its heavy sweetness once, then gently laid it on the glowing embers. Outside, London settled into a soft May dusk, and somewhere far across the Atlantic, a woman in a black veil knelt on stone and began the long, quiet expiation that no court on earth had thought to demand. Poirot closed the curtains, poured himself a small glass of sirop de cassis, and raised it to the gathering night. "To absent friends," he murmured, "and to the locked rooms we carry inside us all." Then he sat in his armchair, stroked his moustaches once for comfort, and allowed the silence to do its healing work. Chapter 9. The Rose That Never Died. In the autumn of 1956, 25 years after the night the gunshot echoed through the Hawthorne mansion, a young Belgian diplomat named Philippe Mertens was posted to Washington. He was meticulous, quietly proud of his small moustache, and secretly devoted to the published cases of Hercule Poirot, whose complete adventures he kept in a locked briefcase the way other men keep photographs of sweethearts. One October afternoon, with the leaves along Massachusetts Avenue burning the same fierce red they had burned in 1931, Mertens found himself walking past the old Embassy Row. The Hawthorne house still stood, though the marble had greyed and the columns were scarred by wartime neglect. A discreet bronze plaque now announced that it was the property of a Catholic charitable foundation. The gates were open. A gardener was burning leaves, and the smoke carried the identical scent of damp earth and bruised roses that Poirot had once catalogued in his green notebook. Mertens paused, drawn by something he could not name. On an impulse, he crossed the gravel and asked the gardener, an old man with a face like cracked walnut, whether visitors were permitted. "Only the garden, sir," the man replied in a soft Virginia drawl. "The sisters keep it for remembrance. Go on through, mind the wet." Beyond the yew hedge lay the rose garden, smaller than memory allowed, but still there. The beds had been replanted many times, yet one bush grew alone at the far end, taller than the rest, its blooms a dark, almost black crimson that seemed to drink the light rather than reflect it. A small iron plaque at its roots read, "Planted in memory of those who lost their way 1931. Sister Mary." Augustine Mertens knelt, touched a petal. It was velvet, heavy with scent, and still bleeding the faint white sap that Poirot had once snapped between gloved fingers. Behind him, a gentle voice spoke, aged yet unmistakably cultivated. "You have the look of a man who knows the story." He turned. An elderly nun stood in the path, black habit dusted with leaf mould, hands tucked into wide sleeves. Her face was thin, finely boned, the eyes a pale winter blue that had once broken hearts in 3 continents. Mertens rose, uncertain whether to bow or salute. "Madame, ma sœur, I know only what the newspapers printed and what Monsieur Poirot permitted to be printed." A faint smile touched her mouth, the ghost of a much-practised charm. "Then you know almost nothing, and perhaps that is merciful." She came closer, moving with the unhurried grace of someone who has long ago stopped running from anything. "This rose was sent to me in 1938, she said, the year I took my final vows. It arrived without a card, wrapped in wet newspaper, posted from Southampton. Only one man in the world knew what a crimson rose meant to me, and what it would cost him to send it." Mertens felt the years collapse like a house of cards. "You are. I was Lydia Hawthorne. Now I am Sister Mary Augustine, and have been for longer than the woman ever lived." She looked at the bush with something close to tenderness. Every autumn it blooms darker than the last, as though it remembers blood better than I do. She drew a small pair of secateurs from her sleeve and snipped one perfect bloom. The stem bled slowly. "Hercule Poirot died last year," she continued, voice steady. "I read the notices in the Catholic Herald. They said natural causes in his sleep. I do not believe it. I think he simply decided the world no longer required his services and closed the file." Mertens found his voice. "He kept your letter." "I know. The superior here received a package after his death. One rose, dried between the pages of a missal, and a single line in his handwriting. Some debts are paid in silence." The rose was already black. She placed the fresh bloom in Mertens's hand. "Take it. Plant it wherever you shall. Settle next. Let it remind you that even the worst of us may tend a garden before we die." Mertens closed his fingers around the stem. A thorn pricked him. A bead of his own blood mingled with the white sap. "And Richard?" he asked softly. "Richard Hale died in 1954, planting trees on a hillside above the Pacific. He never married, never spoke of Washington. On the day he knew the cancer had won, he walked into the forest he had grown, and sat beneath a Douglas fir he himself had set as a sapling in 1941. They found him there at sunrise, quite peaceful, a crimson petal in his pocket that no tree for 1,000 miles could have produced." She turned to go, then paused. "Tell your children, when you have them, that the world is not saved by perfect men, Monsieur Mertens. It is saved by imperfect ones who refuse to let evil have the last chapter." Poirot understood that, so, eventually, did I. She walked away between the dripping hedges, habit brushing the leaves like a whispered absolution. The gardener had vanished. The smoke from his fire rose straight and thin into the October sky. Philippe Mertens stood alone with the dark rose until the light failed. Then he wrapped it carefully in his handkerchief, the same way Poirot had once wrapped a revolver in silk, and carried it back through the gates into a city that had forgotten almost everything except the colour of its autumn leaves. Years later, in a small garden behind the Belgian embassy in Ottawa, a single rosebush grows against a sunny wall. It blooms black-red every October, long after every diplomat who ever knew its story has been posted elsewhere. The gardeners call it the Poirot rose, though no catalogue lists it, and children are warned not to pick the flowers because the thorns draw blood that takes a very long time to stop. And sometimes, on the anniversary of a night no one remembers anymore, an old nun in Quebec receives an unmarked envelope containing one perfect petal and nothing else. She presses it between the pages of a worn breviary, touches it once to her lips, and returns to the quiet work of a woman who has learned that some locked rooms open only from the inside, and that forgiveness, when it finally comes, smells of roses and distant thunder. Chapter 10. The Last Little Grey Cell. On the morning of 12th August 1975, a young English nurse named Felicity Lemon, no relation to the earlier Miss Lemon, though the coincidence amused Poirot in the few moments he was still capable of amusement, entered the flat at Whitehaven Mansions to find her famous patient sitting upright in bed, perfectly dressed in a dove-grey suit. The ends of his moustache waxed to their final, defiant points. A small glass of sirop de cassis stood untouched on the bedside table. The green leather notebook lay closed on the counterpane. Hercule Poirot was dead. He had died, the doctor later said, somewhere between 3 and 4 o'clock, quietly, without fuss, the way a candle gutters when the wax is finally spent. His right hand rested on the cover of the notebook, as though guarding its last secret. His left hand, the hand that had never held a revolver to its own temple, lay relaxed against the sheet. Felicity Lemon, who had grown fond of the precise little Belgian in the 18 months she had tended him, wept without shame. She had expected drama, a final case, perhaps a deathbed revelation, yet he had slipped away with the same impeccable courtesy he had shown in life, apologizing in advance for any inconvenience. Only when the undertaker came did she notice the single object that did not belong in the austere bedroom. A dried, almost black rose pressed between 2 sheets of thin glass, propped against the lamp like a bookmark in the night. No card, no explanation. The petals had kept their shape for nearly 40 years. Dark as old blood, fragrant still with a sweetness that made her think of rain on marble and distant thunder. The will was simplicity itself. The flat and its contents to the nation of Belgium for the encouragement of order and method. Small bequests to George, long retired to Eastbourne, to the faithful Miss Lemon of an earlier era, and to a convent of the Sisters of Charity in Quebec, whose name no one in London had ever heard him mention. The green notebook was to be sealed for 50 years. 50 years and 1 day later, just 14th August 2025, the sealed packet was opened in the presence of the Belgian ambassador, a nervous archivist and a literary executor who had waited half a century for this moment. Inside the familiar cover they found not the expected pages of clues and deductions, but a single sheet of heavy cream paper. The handwriting still firm, the ink only slightly faded. It read, "To whoever reads this when I am gone, you will expect a grand revelation, another twist in the tale. There is none. The Hawthorne case was closed the day the Rose Garden heard the truth. Everything that needed saying was said beneath those windows, and everything that needed forgiving was forgiven long before I left Washington. I kept only one secret, and I carry it now where no customs officer may search." In the winter of 1938, a letter reached me from across the Atlantic, written by a woman who had once worn scarlet and now wore repentance. She confessed that the 6th conspirator, the son, had been innocent after all. I burned the letter as she asked, but I did not burn the knowledge. For 17 years I wondered whether I should have spoken, whether justice had claimed the wrong life. Then, in 1955, a second letter came, this time unsigned, posted from Oregon. A pressed petal and 4 words in a hand I recognized. He died at peace. That was enough. Some truths are too fragile for courtrooms. Some pardons must be granted in silence. The little grey cells served me well for 70 cases and more, but in the end they bowed before something smaller and greater. The heart's capacity to plant a tree it will never sit beneath. If you seek a moral, here it is. Perfection belongs to mathematics and to moustaches. Humanity belongs to imperfect things. Broken latches, recorded gunshots, conspiracies that collapse under their own cleverness, and a single rose that refuses to forget. I have arranged my departure with the neatness I always demanded of life. The syrup is poured, the suit is pressed, the notebook is closed. The world may have its wars and its treaties. I have done my part. Tell the young detectives who come after me that the greatest mystery is never whodunit. It is always why we forgive. H.P. the Verserine. August 1975. The archivist closed the book with trembling fingers. Outside, a soft London rain began to fall. The same rain that had fallen on Washington roses, on Quebec snows, on Oregon hillsides, where a man once planted trees to hide from his past. In the quiet flat, the scent of a crimson rose lingered for a moment longer, then dispersed like the final note of a slow, perfect symphony. The last little grey cell had switched off its light, and the greatest detective the world had ever known was, at last, entirely and irretrievably asleep.